I'm Lisa Hanaira with the Council of State Governments Midwestern Office. I staff the caucus and am managing the logistics for this webinar. We'll start with a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. The slides from the presentations and the recording will be posted on the caucus's website this afternoon at the address you see on the screen. You'll receive a follow-up message with a link to the recording and also the address where you can find both the recording and the slides. To reduce the possibility of feedback or other external noise, while the presentations are running, the conference will be in listen-only mode. After each presentation, we'll open up the lines for questions. We want this webinar to be interactive, so if you have a question, please let us know by either typing your question in the GoToWebinar Questions pane or by clicking on the hand icon to raise your hand. If you accidentally click on the button to raise your hand, just click it again and it'll turn off. Next, a few tips if you do plan to ask a question. If you're using your telephone, please make sure to enter your audio PIN, which you'll find in the audio pane. Press pound, then the PIN, then pound again. If you selected Voice over IP and you're using your computer's microphone and speakers, please test your settings by clicking on the Test Settings link in the audio pane. Your connection to the webinar audience will be muted, so don't worry about anyone hearing you as you test your microphone. If your computer's microphone doesn't appear to be working, you should call in using one of the telephone numbers listed in the audio pane and make sure to enter your PIN. And finally, after the webinar, you'll all be asked to take a very brief survey, just 3 questions. Please take the time to fill out the survey so we can get feedback to help us improve our webinars. I will now turn the floor over to the Chair of the Caucus, Minnesota Senator Ann Rest.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning to everyone. 2 weeks ago, we began our 2-part series on nuclear waste in the Great Lakes region by looking at a proposal to build a deep geologic repository for low and intermediate level radioactive waste near Lake Huron in Ontario. We also heard about how spent nuclear fuel is stored in the U.S. and where, specifically in locations near the Great Lakes. Today, we continue the discussion by looking at Canada's approach to siting a disposal facility for used fuel. We'll also hear about options for reaching bipartisan agreement on a path forward for disposing of the growing inventory of spent fuel in the U.S. We have 3 speakers with us this morning. The first 2 will address Canada's site selection process for a deep geologic repository for spent nuclear fuel. We'll first hear from Elena Mantagaris, who is the Director of Government and External Relations at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, or NWMO, in Canada. Since 2008, she has been responsible for outreach with Canada's federal government and 5 provincial governments involved in the work of NWMO. Previously, Elena worked for 10 years with several federal government departments and was responsible for strategic planning and communications initiatives. She holds a Master of Public Administration from Queen's University. Joining Elena from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is Sean Russell, who is the Director of Environmental Assessment. Sean is responsible for the planning and direction of environmental activities associated with implementing adaptive phased management, Canada's plan for long-term management of used nuclear fuel. He has over 30 years of experience in the radiological and environmental assessment of radioactive waste management facilities. Sean obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in physics from the University of Guelph, Ontario. Our final speaker will be Timothy Frazier, who is a senior advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he directs the center's nuclear waste initiative. Before joining the center, Tim had a long and distinguished career in federal service. While at the U.S. Department of Energy, he was tapped by then Energy Secretary Stephen Chu to be the designated federal officer of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. In 2010, after canceling the Yucca Mountain repository, President Obama directed the Blue Ribbon Commission to develop a new national policy on the long-term management of highly radioactive waste. Before Tim's tenure at DOE headquarters in Washington, D.C., he worked at DOE's Mound site in Dayton, Ohio, as Radioisotope Power System Program Manager and Nuclear Weapons Engineer. I thank all three of our speakers for joining us this morning, and I will now turn the floor over to Elena Mantagaris.
Organization. Hello, thank you for the opportunity to present the work of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Just want to ensure everyone can see the screen properly. The NWMO's mandate is the safe and long-term management of used nuclear fuel generated from electricity power plants. Canada currently has 19 operating nuclear reactors in 2 provinces, New Brunswick and Ontario, but also has used fuel from past reactors and research labs in Quebec and Manitoba. Canadians have been clear that it is unfair to leave used fuel as a burden to future generations to manage, and we must put in place a safe approach for people and the environment. We have benefited from the electricity derived from nuclear energy and have a responsibility to ensure it is safely managed. It is within that context and understanding that the NWMO was formed in 2002. The NWMO's mandate is anchored in the Federal Nuclear Fuel Waste Act and requires that we identify and implement a safe approach for used fuel management, and that we do so collaboratively with Canadians, seeking their input in order to develop and implement an approach that is consistent with Canadian values and priorities. The NWMO is arm's length from government, but does report to Parliament through the tabling of our annual report by the Minister of Natural Resources Canada. The federal government provides oversight to ensure that how we move forward on this important national issue is done in a manner that is consistent with the parameters set out in the Act. Funding for the project is derived by the nuclear energy corporations as required by the Act. Every year, the nuclear energy corporations are required to contribute to a federal trust fund to ensure that full funding is in place to advance this initiative. A funding formula has been approved by the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, and contributions are based on the percentage of used fuel that a company generates. When the NWMO was formed in 2002, we initiated a 3-year dialogue with Canadians. We met with over 18,000 Canadians, including 2,500 Aboriginals and 500 experts in a range of sectors. This involved 120 information sessions across the country. What emerged from the dialogue formed the foundation of what became Canada's plan, known as Adaptive Phased Management. APM best met the key priorities of Canadians and reflects both a technical method and a management system. On the technical side, Canadians preferred that the used fuel be moved from the current 7 interim locations to a single site. They also preferred that the used fuel be managed in a deep geological repository rather than at surface. A key reason for this is that a repository allows for a robust passive safety system and does not require active human management over the long time frames that used fuel remains a hazard. They also wanted continuous monitoring and that the repository be designed and engineered to provide the potential for retrievability, either to address any issues that arise after emplacement underground or to incorporate new approaches to used fuel management resulting from new technologies. The management system, or social engagement aspect of the project, emphasizes the importance of flexible and phased decision-making to reflect the input we receive from continuous engagement from Canadians. It requires that the NWMO be responsive to advances in technology and evolving values of Canadians. Critical to our work is the fact that the NWMO has committed that this project will only move forward in an informed and willing host community in Canada. It is important to note that this project only addresses used fuel generated by Canadian power plants. Canadians were clear that we have a responsibility to manage used fuel that is generated in our country, but that this repository should not be used to manage used fuel from other countries. I'd like to take a moment to describe the material that we are managing. Used fuel is a solid material, not a liquid. It is made of natural uranium and baked into a hard ceramic pellet, approximately the diameter of a penny. The pellets are contained within the fuel bundle. The top right corner of the slide you see in front of you contains an image of the fuel bundle. It's roughly the length of a fire log. A ceramic fuel pellet is extremely durable. It is not flammable, it is not an explosive, nor is it fissile. Used fuel is safely managed above ground at 7 interim storage locations and has been for almost 50 years. Currently, Canada has an inventory, just over 2 million CANDU fuel bundles, and if existing reactors operate to the end of their planned lives, we would have an inventory of about 4 million fuel bundles. We know how to safely manage radioactive materials and how to shield ourselves from radiation. For example, when the used fuel is removed from the reactor, it is placed in a pool of water for 7 to 10 years to cool down. Water is a natural barrier to radiation. After that, the used fuel is placed in dry storage containers made of concrete. A foot of concrete is also a barrier to radiation. A little later in this presentation, my colleague, Sean Russell, will describe the 5 barriers that will be used to contain and isolate used fuel in a deep geological repository. We have a number of communities involved in the NWMO site selection process. We initially had 22 communities come forward expressing interest in learning more about the project, and through various screenings, we have removed 7 communities from the process. There are currently 15 communities that remain involved in our siting process. On this map before you, we've identified the 15 communities as well as the 7 interim storage locations where used fuel is currently safely managed. There remains 1 community in the province of Saskatchewan, situated on the far left of the map, and the remainder are in Ontario, 10 communities across the northern region of the province and 4 in the southern part of the province. The NWMO site selection process is a multi-year, multi-phased process. We are in very early stages of the siting process. Currently, we are in step 3 with communities. It is expected to take approximately 10 years to advance through the 9 steps you see outlined on this slide. The step 9 construction phase is estimated to take an additional 10 years. Thus, for planning purposes, 2035 is the earliest possible in-service date for this repository, assuming we identify a suitable host community and can prove the safety of the project to the regulator during the federal environmental assessment process. No community has agreed to host this project, nor has the NWMO made any commitment to a community. Communities are only learning more about the project, and the NWMO is working collaboratively with them to assess if they are both technically and socially suitable to host this project. As part of its assessment process, the NWMO is examining the following topic areas. As the community advances in the process, the level of detail for each of these lines of inquiry becomes more specific and is aimed at supporting the federal environmental assessment process. The NWMO is looking for a host community that meets all the technical safety criteria identified in our site selection process document for geoscience, engineering, transportation, and the environment. In addition, the NWMO is looking for a community that demonstrates the strongest potential at a social and cultural level for alignment between the project and the community's vision for itself. The NWMO has committed to facilitating the well-being of a potential host community and will work with community members to explore whether and how this project can help support their community aspirations. Underpinning all our work at the NWMO is a commitment to ongoing dialogue with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities interested in learning more. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to my colleague, Sean Russell, to describe the technical safety aspects of the project.
Thank you, Elena. The Deep Geological Repository is a multi-barrier system designed to safely contain and isolate used fuel over the very long term. It will be constructed at a depth of about 500 meters, or approximately 550 yards, below ground surface, depending on the geology of the site, and will consist of a network of placement rooms for the used fuel. Used fuel will be transported from the 7 interim storage sites to the central facility, unloaded and repackaged into long-lived, corrosion-resistant containers for placement in the repository. The containers will be lowered by a shaft or a ramp, depending on the site, and placed in vertical or horizontal boreholes drilled into the rock. They will then be sealed using bentonite clay. The rooms will be backfilled and monitored for an extended period of time prior to decommissioning and closure of the facility once the community, the NWMO and the regulators agree that it is appropriate. Post-closure monitoring would then be implemented. A robust safety case must be developed with confidence that the project can be safely implemented at the site, including transportation, and can meet or exceed the requirements of the regulatory authorities and the community. The first barrier is the fuel itself. Uranium pellets are hard, high-density ceramic materials that are extremely durable and are very resistant to dissolution in the geochemically reducing groundwater conditions found at repository depth. The second barrier is the zircaloy metal tubes that surround the uranium fuel. Zircaloy is also a strong corrosion-resistant metal. The third barrier is the long-lived used fuel container. Current designs consist of an inner vessel of steel to provide mechanical strength and an outer layer of copper to provide corrosion resistance in the underground repository. Similar designs for long-lived used fuel containers have been included in the recent Finnish and the Swedish Deep Geological Repository license applications and are also being considered in the designs being developed by the Swiss Radioactive Waste Management Organization as well. The fourth barrier is the bentonite clay, which surrounds the used fuel container and is also used as backfill material in the placement rooms, access tunnels, and shafts. Bentonite clay has several unique functions. It swells when exposed to groundwater and fills the void spaces in the repository. It reduces the movement of groundwater near the container due to its low hydraulic conductivity, and it restricts the movement of radionuclides should there be a release from the container in the future. And finally, the fifth barrier is the host rock. The geosphere provides isolation of used fuel from the surface events such as climate change or glaciation, and the depth of the repository, about 550 yards below ground surface, reduces the likelihood of inadvertent human intrusion into the repository. The geosphere also provides the necessary conditions to ensure geochemical stability at depth, very slow movement of groundwater, very slow migration or transport of radionuclides, and very long travel times, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years from repository depth to surface. Investigations into the long-term management of used fuel have a long history in Canada, and the deep geological repository concept identified early in the nuclear program. A deep geological repository is internationally recognized as the safest known way of containing and isolating used nuclear fuel over the very long periods of time. Case studies began in the early 1990s, starting with the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited Environmental Impact Statement, which was submitted in 1994. Case studies also present post-closure safety assessment methodology that demonstrate how the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's expectations would be met. The methodology includes describing the deep geological repository system and the interaction of various safety components over the long term, identifying scenarios to test, and determining the acceptability of the results. Safety assessments identify factors that are important to safety, and they test a number of scenarios. For example, criteria are established for the radiological protection of people and the environment, and also for the protection from hazardous substances. The factors important to safety are identified and include such things as the characteristics of the used fuel, the used fuel container, and the geosphere. The scenarios test changes in these factors all the way to what-if scenarios or occurrences, such as having all the containers fail. The post-closure safety assessments show, typically, that the predicted maximum dose rates are several orders of magnitude below the regulatory limits and occur many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years into the future. I'll turn the presentation back over to Elena.
Thank you, Sean. Transportation is also a key component of the APM planning and implementation process for long-term used fuel management. All transportation equipment, packages, and transportation activities will meet or exceed regulatory requirements. The NWMO is beginning technical assessments to determine whether transportation routes currently exist or can be developed to safely move used nuclear fuel from the licensed interim storage facilities to hypothetical locations and communities currently involved in the NWMO site selection process. The NWMO is studying road and rail access to communities engaged in the site selection process. Both of these modes are potential options for used fuel transport. The NWMO is not studying the option of transporting used nuclear fuel by water. The NWMO will need to demonstrate the safety and security of any transportation system before the shipments of used nuclear fuel can begin. As the site selection process advances, the NWMO will work closely with those who are potentially affected by transportation to understand and address their questions and concerns. I would like to conclude by emphasizing that the NWMO is in very early stages of a siting process to identify an informed and willing host community for this initiative. No decisions have been made, and there are many assessment steps remaining before a site is selected that is both technically and socially suitable. The NWMO's primary goal is safety, to protect people and the environment through all aspects of this project. The NWMO has an extensive engagement program with interested Canadians, communities involved in our siting process, with Aboriginal communities located in proximity to potential sites being assessed, as well as with surrounding communities in areas where interest has been expressed in learning more. The NWMO will continue to provide information and learning opportunities to build understanding of the project and to address questions and concerns. Thank you. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Elena and Sean. We have a few minutes for questions. Please remember to raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon or typing your question. And I'll start off. I'm curious as to what level of involvement, if any, the elected members of either the Saskatchewan or Ontario legislative bodies have had with the NWMO, and just what the relationship, what that relationship is.
Thank you for the question, Lisa. My role, in fact, is to engage quite actively with the elected representatives. So each of the communities involved in our siting process is represented by a member of parliament federally or a member of provincial parliament at the provincial level. And I have met with all of the elected representatives federally and provincially a number of times for each of the ridings where communities are involved in our process. I also work actively with ministers' offices that are responsible for our portfolio. So, for example, Transport Canada or Natural Resources Canada at the federal level, and then provincially as well, their counterparts. Sometimes they're called something a little different, like a Department of Energy or a Department of Natural Resources. And also we have our Departments of Aboriginal Affairs as well. So engagement has been quite frequent with all of the elected representatives federally and provincially.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, Lisa?
Yeah, yes, this is Lisa. I see Senator Boer from Michigan has his hand raised. Senator Boer, go ahead.
Okay, I've been unmuted, so that's good. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, we hear here in Michigan, nuclear waste moves from the United States to Canada. Is there, I heard about Canada here today, is any of that nuclear waste coming from the U.S.?
No, it's not. All of the used fuel that will be stored in this repository is Canada's used nuclear fuel that's generated from our nuclear power plants. And in fact, Canadians were clear that they did not want this repository to be seen as a way for other countries to have their used fuel managed. So it will only be for Canada's used nuclear fuel.
Is any of, at the present, is Canada taking any of the nuclear waste from the United States?
No, not at all. Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much.
How many nuclear power plants does Canada currently authorize?
So currently we have 19 operating reactors located in New Brunswick and Ontario, our two provinces. Quebec had a nuclear reactor operating until the end of 2013. They just stopped nuclear energy production at that point. But there is used nuclear fuel located in 7 locations in Canada. So not only New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario, but there's also some in Manitoba as well, another province.
What led you to rule out transporting any nuclear waste by water?
It's not that water transportation is not technically feasible. In fact, water transportation is done by other countries around the world. I think specifically of Sweden and Japan. However, we are sensitive to the fact and responsive to the types of concerns raised by Canadians about water transportation on the Great Lakes. We recognize there's a sensitivity about water transportation, given that there's a perception, given the fact that it's drinking water and there's a perception of used nuclear fuel that is perhaps hard to overcome. But certainly in response to that kind of sensitivity, we have determined that at this point we will only focus, on road and rail transportation. In the future, only if there's a strong societal interest in exploring transportation by water would further study and engagement through dialogue be required by the NWMO with communities, First Nations, and Métis people. And then obviously it would involve appropriate government departments to determine if water transportation is an appropriate option. But certainly we're not seeing the societal appetite for water transportation and thus focusing only on road and rail.
Thank you.
We have
are there other questions, Lisa?
Yes, there are, Senator Rest. We'll go next to Rich Gennady from Pennsylvania. Rich, your line is open. Rich, we can't hear you, so can you go ahead and type your question in the questions pane, and I'll go ahead and ask it. I do have a written question from Laura Haynes. Why are these locations, with the exception of one, surrounding the Great Lakes? Is there nowhere else in Canada this can be placed?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the NWMO siting process is based on communities coming forward to learn more about the process. It is not a top-down or central process where we're trying to find the best location. We are looking at communities that have expressed interest in learning more about the project, and we are currently in a stage of doing preliminary assessments on those communities to assess whether or not there's a strong safety case and a strong support from a social perspective on bringing the process forward into another stage of siting.
If I could add to that, it's Elena speaking, not only to emphasize Sean's point that it's a voluntary siting process, so they came forward, but also many of these communities, perhaps on a small map, look like they're all adjacent to the lake, but in fact several of them are quite a distance from the lake as well. So I would sort of look on a larger scale map to see that several can be a few hundred kilometers away from the lakefront as well.
Okay, and
However, that said, safety is paramount, and any site assessed will have to meet safety criteria for them to move forward.
Thank you. We'll go back to Senator Boer for another question. Senator Boer?
Yes. I see this as Region 2. How many regions do we have in the nuclear waste? Did I see that Region 2? How many regions do we have in nuclear waste? Or doesn't that mean, or am I reading something wrong here? This is Region 2.
Was this on a map?
Yeah.
Elena, could you go back to your map, please?
I need it. Senator, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the reference to region.
Okay, I had seen either when we looked at what was going to be presented today, somewhere in the reading material, I saw a Region 2. and that was where the question came from. And I'll have to go back if it doesn't come up here and find out what that was referencing. But
Okay.
if there isn't, and that's not an issue, then I'll have to find out what was meant by Region 2.
Okay.
Lisa, I wonder if it's the reference to Part 2 in the title of the session.
It could be, but it could be something else. And Senator Boer, if you find the reference, just give me a call or email me, and I'll be happy to address that.
Perfect.
Thanks. Okay. And now we have time for a couple more questions. Rich Gennady typed his question. Has Canada developed a formal plan for the volunteer process? And have you developed preliminary screening criteria for the potential site of a permanent repository did you do that before you began to seek a volunteer community?
Yes, in fact, I'm going to go back to this slide here. The steps in the site selection process are just a summary version of a 50-page document we set out when initiating the process, listing not only the steps but all of the criteria that would be applied to assess both the technical suitability and the social suitability of a community to determine if they were appropriate to host this project. It was initiated in May 2010, and as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we had 22 communities come forward. And as we evaluate and assess these communities, we start to narrow down the number of communities in our process. Ultimately, the aim is to get to 1 community. So currently, we've gone from 22 communities to 15 communities, and we expect to continue narrowing down over the next few years.
Thank you. Well, we do have one more question, but in the interest of time, let's move on to Tim Frazier, and we will likely have more time at the end where we can ask other questions as well. So Tim Frazier, I will make you the presenter now. And Elena, thank you very much. I hope you will stay and listen in on the rest of the webinar.
All right, you should see my first slide now.
Yes, we do.
What I'm going to talk about is America's nuclear future, taking action to address nuclear waste. It's a project of the Bipartisan Policy Center has put together to really, let me go to my next slide. The goal is really to spur the action to address nuclear waste. It was mentioned at the beginning that I was a designated federal officer for the Blue Ribbon Commission. And as I am careful to remind everybody when we talk about the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, that it was tasked only with providing recommendations and advice back to the Secretary of Energy, which was then forwarded up to President Obama. We were really precluded from doing anything that looked like action on our own. Number one, we were a presidential commission and certainly didn't want to get out too far in front of those headlights. But primarily to provide the recommendations, advice, good thoughts by a bunch of good people that were involved in what was almost a 2-year process. But not much action. One of the things I liked about this project when Bipartisan Policy Center talked to me about it is it's very action-oriented. We're really going to try to move things off the dime in the United States. This is just U.S. So we're going to spur action. A couple of objectives of the project to expand the dialogue, start regional conversations again on nuclear waste. It's my perception that things have kind of gone dormant in regards to nuclear waste. Really trying to move things forward, and I can make a few comments about that later. Bipartisan interests. There are very few subjects in the United States and in D.C. here that are bipartisan. But you know, the 104 operating reactors, well, the 100 operating reactors we have in the United States now are not Democrat or Republican, and they are in states all over the United States. Some of them are in Republican districts, some of them in Democrat districts, some of them are in blue states, red states. So it's really, unless you're in Nevada, It's really an across-the-board issue. So what we want to do is the third bullet there, develop an implementation plan to really try to break down the barriers that are stopping us from moving the ball forward. And I'll come back to that in a minute. We want to take all, there are a number of parties and a number of people involved in trying to move the nuclear waste discussion forward. But they're kind of, there are clusters here and there's clusters over here, but in general, there isn't really one force either trying to tie them all together or trying to herd them all together. So one of the things we want to do is try to provide some coordination of these diverse groups and the parties that are interested in moving it forward. Think of it, the DPC being bipartisan and only wanting to solve the solution or to solve the problem, provide a path forward, an actionable path forward, is could perform as the honest broker, if you would, from all these different groups and all the different competing interests of the groups. And the last objective there is really to establish the sense of urgency that existed, and I say that existed because I mentioned earlier, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of pressure on solving this particular problem. After the Blue Ribbon Commission report was released in January of 2012, there was a flurry of activities. We did a whole bunch of Hill meetings in front of 2 different House committees, 2 different committees on the Senate side. Towards the end of that year, Senator Bingaman, before he left office, dropped his bill that was a nuclear waste bill that would have implemented some of the actions of the Blue Ribbon Commission, some of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission, and then it kind of went quiet. Senator Wyden took over, Senate Energy and Natural Resources. Suddenly there was a flurry of activity again. Senator Wyden with Murkowski, Alexander, and Feinstein dropped a bill that generated a lot of concern. We got some BRC commissioners out of their private life role to go back up to the Hill and discuss the Wyden bill. Senator Baucus gets nominated to be ambassador. Senator Wyden moves on to finance. Senator Landrieu takes over, and once again we're back to things have just been kind of quiet. There just doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency. So how are we going to go about this? Well, the first thing we're going to do, and this is what I'm in the process of doing now, is we're going to set up an advisory council. These advisory council members are going to be, former elected congressmen or representatives and senators. We're going to get the NGOs, the environmental NGOs here involved. Also very important is the nuclear utilities as well as the nuclear industry. The nuclear utilities in the United States are the generators of the waste and the caretakers of the waste at this point. So they certainly have a stake in it. But the nuclear industry in the U.S., this is the URSs, the CH2M Hills, the Bechtels, the Fluors, that are the ones that are going to have to be involved when we get to the real implementation of whatever the solution is in the United States. There are going to be some members of the Blue Ribbon Commission just to ensure continuity. And then we're going to establish an executive committee of probably 4 or 5 very senior, very well-known, most of them are former elected. And that's going to be key to helping just the bipartisan policy. And by the way, there's 5 of them, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats and 1 independent, if you will. And we'll probably release those names or the entire membership sometime next week, maybe the week after. I'm just not ready to throw them out there yet. The advisory council, given the breadth and the scope of everything that they have had experience with, have worked on, knowledgeable of, are going to provide just overall direction and guidance to the project. Not wanting us to stray too far off the beaten path. If they see something that looks like we might not have addressed sufficiently, and we'll go back and look at it again, that type of thing. So I mentioned barriers earlier. Our approach to identifying these barriers, I mean, I have a list of them. Probably any one of you have a list of them. But the thought process here is we're going to go to a regional view of this. So we're going to have 4 regional meetings. We're going to do one in the Northeast, one in the Southeast, one probably in the Midwest, not probably in the Midwest, likely Chicago. And then we're going to do one out in the western part of the United States. And the objective here is to realize or bring new thoughts and new views to the table on just what the barriers are and what we think the collective we, from a regional perspective, and then as we roll these up, think opportunities to get past these barriers be. Now, I put current thinking because this isn't a done deal yet, but I wanted to let you know at least where I'm headed in formatting these regional meetings. They'll be, in my mind, once again, not a done deal, but this is where it's headed, I think. We're going to do a morning session and an afternoon session. The morning session is going to be 15 to 20 people, invitation only. We're going to sit around a U table and talk and try to, and these are all regionally based people. Try to talk about what barriers they see. We're going to try to get a consensus. You know, these are the barriers, and then we're going to try to get the list of. These are, for each barrier, these are potential solutions or potential actions that would help us break through that barrier so that we can actually move forward. And I've said lately that it's not necessary that we actually have to break through the barrier. We just, if all we do is lower it so that we're able to get over the barrier, that's perfectly fine as well. Okay, so that's the morning session. We're going to have an afternoon session. If you're familiar with the Blue Ribbon Commission, we were extremely transparent, I think. And I think that bought the Commission a lot of credibility with the stakeholders and the public writ large to allow us or to allow them to comment and be involved. So with that as a view that I obviously held when I was DFO for BRC, I'm bringing that to this. So the afternoon session is going to be public, planned to be public. We'll probably have a couple of panels, 3-member panels. The first panel would talk about the barriers that we came up in the morning session, and then there'll be an interactive Q&A with the public that's there to continue the public dialogue. The second panel will be to discuss the actions that we came up with. Once again, a dialogue back. We're going to do summaries of each of these meetings. We're going to post them online. We're going to ask for feedback and comments on the reports, the summary reports from the meetings. We got a lot of comments for the Blue Ribbon Commission, and in fact, a lot of valuable comments. We got a lot of comments that weren't so valuable, but we did get a lot of good, thoughtful commentary. So we're eager to see what that brings us. Then, for those of you who know John Kotek, who is the executive director of the BRC, John, I want to make sure I give John credit for this, but the BRC issued a what we heard report, which was vital for us to go forward and formulate the policies and recommendations that we've done, because it was a summary of all the meetings we've had, all the comments we've had. So we put the what we heard report out and let people comment on that. That allowed them to, no, you didn't hear that correctly. Yes, you heard that correctly. Well, it's really not just transportation. It's the transportation and handling of spent nuclear fuel or the nuclear waste. So I think that's probably going to be maybe spring of next year. Oh, I should have said this is a 15 or 18-month project. We're going to try to have everything wrapped up in June of next year. So up at the top, you see develop an implementation plan for actions. I mentioned earlier actionable items, and my vision for this is state legislatures, you go do this. NGOs, the environmental NGOs, you guys spin your people up and do this. And I think if we bring all these pieces together, we might really be able to see some movement. Now, I should be careful to say that this isn't a solution to where we're going to put nuclear waste in the United States, where we would either consolidated storage or disposal. It's an action plan to get us to the point of where we can actually move and do something, because we haven't. We're going to consider the comments of stakeholders. We'll probably put a draft action plan out, let people shoot at it. We are going to include in the action plan public and stakeholder engagement, keeping everybody engaged and enthused and moving forward. We're going to try to make sure over this 18 months, we're going to try to make sure that one piece of the action plan is ways that we can ensure that the nuclear waste issues remain in the public and remain noticeable, remain in the discussion. We're going to use some of our high-powered people on the executive committee to write some op-eds. We'll do regional, national editorial boards. This is all the stuff. We'll do print and radio media. The Bipartisan Policy Center is pretty astute at using social media, and we'll promote some public events as well. Oops. So obviously, to get any of this done, you're going to have, I think anyone would tell you, regardless of whether Yucca Mountain comes back or doesn't come back, there's going to have to be real interaction with Congress and with the administration. So we've got, part of this is designed to assist Congress and the administration, help them with hearings, help them with draft legislation, policy, all the things you see listed there. And then what we want to do is help them. There was a guy, and I'm not going to be able to remember his name. But he said you have to remember that many of the elected officials up on the Hill weren't around whenever the Yucca Mountain fight was being fought. And Yucca Mountain is not relevant to them. They haven't been up on the Hill. They're all relatively newcomers. So we're also going to use their expertise to provide, to help the people up on the Hill and everybody else, understand the technical and policy issues. And then we'll probably do a few regional workshops and then maintain, this is key, maintain the relationship with all these diverse interested parties to try to focus them in on, making real progress. And I think that's that. Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Tim. We do have a few minutes for questions. Wonder if there's anyone out there that would like to, that has a comment or a question for Tim.
This is Lisa. I had a question for Tim. Tim, it sounds like what you're describing is something very similar to the dialogue with citizens that Elena Mantagaris talked about earlier. Are you looking to Canada's experience and what the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has done in Canada to get any lessons learned from their national dialogue?
No, because I don't know. The answer is no. And the reason is we're looking. We're not trying to solve the issue. They're trying to solve their issue and cite a repository. We are trying to break down the barriers to get us to the point where we can cite a repository and do the kind of things that they're doing. I think at that point, and by the way, the BRC looked at the Canadian effort during the the DRC days. And I think it's a fine effort, and I think whenever we move forward to actually getting to the point of siting and starting that conversation, it's a reasonable model to follow. But until then, what we're trying to do is just get us to the point where we can do that. One of the barriers that we've got in the United States is, all the money's locked up. We've got, as you may well know, we have several communities in the United States that have expressed an interest in hosting a consolidated storage and or potentially being a repository. And what are they doing? They're trying to get funding so that they can educate all the people, so that they can look at the risks, so they can look at the benefits and make a decision on whether they want to get involved. But there's no one, DOE is not giving them any money because DOE feels like they don't have the authority to do anything. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at, is getting it moving, getting the conversation started, getting action taken so that somebody, whether it be DOE or whether it be the new entity that the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended be established, to move forward and actually do something.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Senator Boer has his hand raised. Senator Boer, your line is open.
Thank you, Tim. I'm a senator in the state of Michigan, and you hit on it, the turnover on the Hill, or turnover in the states, is a huge problem. I mean, 6 years in the House in the state of Michigan, 8 years in the Senate, you're done. You're done. And a lot of this stuff take time to understand it. My point, I guess, today here is that you're going to hold meetings in the Midwest, most likely Chicago.
Yeah, it seems to be the leading candidate.
And you will invite a certain number of people there. Will that be put out? Are those names of the people that get invited? What are you expecting from the invited ones? And will that be transparent? Would elected officials be able to go and say, well, this is who this Tim Frazier and his organization invited for some specific reason, then in the afternoon or whatever, have the public in? What's the purpose of the invited guests?
Well, so the purpose of the invited guests is to allow me the flexibility of inviting knowledgeable, thoughtful people in the region to come in and have a private discussion without particular attribution of whatever they might have to say. And the fine line that I was balancing between not having anything public at all and having a portion of the meetings public where we would, excuse me, be able to review the results of the morning's session and get some public input and public comment on the things that we were looking at is about the best I could come up with. I hadn't, to be honest with you, I hadn't thought about whether I'd make the names of the people invited to the morning session public or not. Just hadn't given any thought.
Unmuted.
Just hadn't given any thought.
Okay, well, sometimes we wonder that if a particular group of people are invited there, and so I can say I am these particular people, that's their opinion of why we have these barriers or not, and it's just those select group particular idea, not weighed in against the public's,
Right.
So it would be nice to be able to know who was invited to those kind of meetings.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I just hadn't thought about that particular piece, so I don't want to make a rash answer, either one way or the other. What I'm hopeful to do is that whenever we publish the summary results of that particular meeting, that people would comment on it and they'd be able to even broaden the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Boer, for that question. Tim, I have a quick question, and then I'd like to go to a question that had been raised earlier for our NWMO speakers. My question is just, what is your time frame for holding these regional meetings, particularly the one in, assuming it's Chicago? What dates are you looking at?
The way it looks now is we're going to have our first one in June, I think. The second one will probably be in September. We're looking at November would be, well, let me go back and say, it looks like the Northeast is going to be in June. The Southeast is going to be in early September. The Midwest one, whether it's in Chicago or anywhere else, it's likely November. And after the first of the year, we'll do the one out west. So they're kind of, I try to do it every other month, but the summer kind of hoses things up a little bit. But you know, once we get past the summer, you know, it'll be you know, September, November, and January for the last three.
Okay. And then we do have a question for you, Tim, from Rich Chinati. Would the invited guests be of diverse background, that is legislative staff, policymakers, technical members of academia?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted the flexibility to invite those that I thought could make a real change or a real effort. It's going to be exactly those people. It's, you know, we would expect that depending on, you know, what day of the week it was, whether the local congressional delegations were in town or not, I certainly would consider inviting them. But, you know, policy people, technical people, the local environmental people. If states have like an advisory council on nuclear power or nuclear energy or nuclear waste, we'd certainly invite, you know, the head of that. It's those kind of people that that will be knowledgeable. I mean, it's only 2 hours or maybe 2.5 hours, and what I don't want to have to do is educate, you know, nuclear fuel in the United States is complex and wide open, and to try to educate that and then have a thoughtful discussion is just not going to work. So these will be informed, thoughtful people from a diverse background, everything from environmental and type. You know, if there are people that are against nuclear power, I welcome them as well.
Okay.
I didn't mention it, and I should mention it here. This is not this like the Blue Ribbon Commission, this bipartisan policy effort is going to be agnostic on nuclear power. We're neither for it or against it. And what helps me in bringing the enviros to the table, the NGOs particularly, is if we shut down every nuclear power plant in the United States tomorrow, we still have a huge spent nuclear fuel problem. So, and that seems to resonate anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be a diverse group.
Thank you for your presentation, Tim. And I know we're bumping up on the top of the hour, but I promised two people who had a similar question that I would ask it of Elena and Sean. And the question gets at, it's from Representative Terry Brown and Barbara Takahashi from Representative Robin Gable's office. You know, why not look for the best site for the repository? Why focus foremost on volunteers? Doesn't that sort of rule out some more remote locations where maybe there isn't a community, or the community might not be interested?
Lisa, it's Elena speaking, and I'll ask Sean to jump in as well. I think that if I go back in time in Canada in the 80s, one of the companies here, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, sort of approach this initiative as a technical initiative. Just find a spot on a map that looks sweet and do your technical testing there and move forward. And the reality is what that resulted in was a lot of people saying, what are you doing in my backyard? And we ended up having a panel established here in Canada that sat for 9 years to discuss what should be Canada's long-term approach to use nuclear fuel. And the some of the key recommendations that emerged from that were really critical, and that led to the formation of our organization. And the key one I'd flag is that the Seaborne panel that sat for 9 years indicated that this is the kind of project that can't simply be approached as a technical initiative, that you have to have citizens on side with you to move forward, so that the social dimension of a project like this is critical to success. So if we were to reproduce the approach that AECL had taken, we likely would have been faced with failure. By introducing a voluntary siting process, it's really people who are prepared to learn about this and consider this and determine if it's suitable for them that are coming forward. And so we have a basis of dialogue, so that it's not seen to be a top-down imposition on individuals, but rather a bottom-up process, very democratic, very advanced in a public policy sort of approach and format, because it's collaborative with Canadians. And that's seen as a best practice, not only here in Canada, but certainly by several other countries around the world who they too are looking at trying to cite their own repositories for used fuel.
Okay, thank you, Elena. We'll leave it there because we need to move on so that Senator Rest can do the wrap-up. Senator Rest, back to you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, and thank you to all three of our speakers and for the participants who joined us today. And I do have a few announcements to make. First, I want to remind the Illinois legislators on the call that the caucus will be co-sponsoring a Great Lakes Policy Workshop for Illinois legislators this coming Tuesday, April 29th from 4 until 5:30 p.m. At the State Capitol building. If you haven't already put the event on your calendar, I highly encourage you to do so. The workshop will address stormwater and wastewater management, as well as workable options to prevent the transfer of AIFs between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River basins. There's no cost to attend, but it would be helpful if you could register in advance. And you can do that by calling the CSG Midwestern office at the number you see on the slide, or by visiting the registration link. And speaking of registration, June 30th is the deadline to register for the caucus's 2014 annual meeting, which will take place on July 24th and 25th in Quebec City. Our hosts, the National Assembly of Quebec, are planning a very special reception and dinner on July 24th with a full-day meeting to follow on July 25th. You'll find the agenda and the registration materials on the caucus's website. Finally, I want to remind the legislators on the line that if you are not yet a member of the caucus, you may enroll by visiting our website or the online enrollment link shown on this slide. There are no cost to membership, only benefits. Caucus membership is open to all legislators from the 8 U.S. states and the 2 Canadian provinces in the Great Lakes region, and I encourage you to enroll today. And now for final comment, over to Lisa.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Remember to watch for a follow-up message with information on where to find the slides and the recording from today's webinar. Also, please take a minute to fill out the short survey that'll pop up as soon as we're done. I hope you'll join us again for a future webinar after the caucus's meeting this summer, and that you'll tell your colleagues about this helpful resource for staying up to date on issues that affect the Great Lakes. This concludes our webinar. Have a great weekend, everyone.